All right, welcome everyone to our May 2025 Lunch and Learn. Today we've asked our colleague Randall to come and talk to us a little bit about potassium in the vineyard and how we can manage that leading into the fruit. This topic was requested a couple times, and I knew Randall would be the best person to cover this for us. So I'm going to let Randall take it away. Remember, we're recording this, but we won't record the discussion at the end, so we can have a nice little discussion about what maybe you've seen in your vineyards and your fruit in the past couple years or whatnot. So take it away, Randall.
Okay, so I was asked to talk about managing potassium in the vineyard and fruit, and we're going to kind of provide a little bit of background on general kind of plant nutrition too, just to so we're all on the same page, so to speak. I think there's a lot of misconceptions about plant nutrition that we maybe need to kind of address first before we maybe get into the details of potassium. So we'll talk about that, potassium in the soil, what potassium and where it is in grapes, my personal advice on the best way to determine if you need potassium in vineyards, and then also what are some practices on how to manage it. And there's a lot of great resources out there. On the viticulture side, probably fewer actually. If you're there's a couple just standard publications. The Wine Grape Production for Eastern North America that has a lot of good info. The Meadows Grape Production Guide has a lot of good info, but in terms of the enology side, there's a ton of great resources about potassium and wine and so forth that I was kind of prepping for this presentation. I just looked at. Again, I'm not a winemaker or anything like that, but just as kind of a reference point. So a lot of great resources out there for you to utilize. So when we look at plant growth, it's not a linear thing. So if plant growth is this green line, and the amount of nutrients available is on the bottom. So we increase nutrients as we go to the right. We increase growth as we go farther up. It's not a linear thing. Once we get a certain amount of nutrients, we don't gain a lot of growth, and it can be tricky to know where we're at in terms of where that is. And so optimal is generally where we want to be. We want to be not at the maximum yield or maximum growth or anything like that. That's just not cost effective, to be honest with you, because as you add more and more nutrients, you get less and less response. And so being on the high side is generally not cost effective. It's not necessary, and it's just not practical. We get way too much, we get toxic, and that's very rare for macronutrients like nitrogen, potassium. You'd have to apply a lot to be toxic, but every now and then we see that with micronutrients. So optimal is kind of where we want to be. Low, the problem with being low is that it's kind of what we often refer to as a hidden hunger. We actually can't see deficiency symptoms on the plant. The plant looks normal, and I know this isn't a grapevine, this is a tomato plant, but if we're kind of in that low, optimal, and high categories, we don't know where we're at unless we have some actual numbers, because the plant's going to look very, very similar. So we don't want to be in that low category because we're losing yield if we're in the low category, but we probably don't know it. Once they're actually deficient, that means we actually see physical symptoms on the plant where they've been low for a while, and we didn't recognize it because we didn't see symptoms, but deficiency symptoms pop up eventually. And then when it's toxic, we can see toxicity symptoms as well. Again, that's pretty rare in a macronutrient like potassium, but we don't want to be excessively on the high side. We don't want to be on the low side. We definitely don't want to be on the deficient side. So let's say you accidentally do get in that deficient world. Where are we going to see a potassium deficiency? Well, we kind of categorize nutrients into two categories. One is called mobile and one is called immobile. And mobile nutrients are ones that once they're in a plant, the plant can move them to where it's needed, so to speak. And so basically what that means is if we have a grapevine shoot here, mobile deficiency, we'll see deficiency symptoms worse than the old leaves, and the new leaves will look a lot better. Now it's not always as cut and dry, so to speak, as that, but generally, if we're seeing deficiency symptoms as attributed kind of this triangle here, it's going to be worse in the old growth and less in the new growth. So the new growth is going to look better than the old growth. And so we want to be looking at our older leaves to see if we have the traditional symptoms of a potassium deficiency, if that's something we're concerned about. I couldn't find my great pictures of a potassium deficiency, so I got way too many pictures on my phone. This is a potassium deficiency on a different fruit crop, and you can see the new leaves look pretty good. Those young leaves look pretty good. But the old leaves, we see interveinal chlorosis that is turning what we call necrotic, and necrotic means dead. So potassium deficiencies usually have interveinal chlorosis, so the veins are still dark green. In between is kind of yellow, and eventually that turns brown and necrotic, and sometimes the leaves even die completely. So this is kind of a classic potassium deficiency symptom. Again, not in grape, but it's going to look the same, just with a different leaf shape. So how does potassium move in the soil? It doesn't move very quickly. It's one of those nutrients that it's not like nitrogen where it leaches a lot if it's in the nitrate form, and so it moves very slowly in the soil to roots. And we don't want to get too soil chemistry like, but it primarily moves through diffusion, not through like a current of water towards those roots. And I'll explain that here in a little bit. And so placement is very important. This is one of those nutrients that it would be best if you could band potassium under the trellis if you have a weed-free zone where most of those roots are, because again, it moves very slowly in the soil, so it makes sense to band it under the trellis if possible. Again, that's not always possible, and so forth. So keep that in mind. Or it's ideally we make sure you have sufficient potassium in the rooting zone before we plant. Again, because it doesn't move very quickly in the soil. So I got some cartoon versions of roots here and potassium in the soil, just kind of maybe drive home why this matters. There's just like nitrogen and calcium and so forth. As these roots are taking up water, nitrogen is kind of riding a wave on that current towards those roots, and so nitrogen from a ways away, not a crazy amount ways away, will, as those roots are sucking up water, will move along that current towards the roots. Potassium doesn't do that as much. It doesn't really catch a ride on that current towards the water. Again, this is why placement's important. How potassium primarily gets to roots is that root will absorb the potassium directly around it, and then there's a process called diffusion that will slowly redistribute it. And so a real world analogy is, let's say you drink coffee and you put a lump of sugar in it. If I stir that sugar up, it's going to distribute very quickly. And that's how nitrogen in a sense moves to roots. It catches a ride on that current. If you don't stir that sugar, given time, it will eventually spread out in that cup evenly, a cup of coffee or whatever you're drinking, tea, but it just takes a lot longer amount of time. And so potassium is the latter. It has to spread from a low salt or high salt concentration to a low. And so primarily, not 100%. And so that's why it's pretty important that if we're going to spend the money to apply it, that we try and get it near that root system, because it's going to take a while to get there. So if you look at generalities of potassium, potassium is needed in the vines and fruit. It's used in a lot of different ways. It's not as simple as saying potassium does one thing. There's potassium throughout the entire parts of the vine. Some of the things that it gets known for is like water control in the plant. There's been some studies with that. But regardless, low amount of potassium is not good for vines. They're not going to grow very good. Potassium is probably needed for yeast to grow as well. So if you're going to have low K in your fruit, it's probably not good on the winemaker side. But high potassium is also not good. There's some correlations, not super strong correlations, but generally the higher your amount of potassium, generally the higher the pH of the fruit, juice, must, wine, whatever you want to call it, whatever you're looking at. Again, it's not 100% accurate always. There's a pretty strong or pretty good, I don't want to say strong, but a decent correlation that if you have lots of potassium in your fruit, you can have a likelihood of having a higher pH. Again, not always accurate, but there's a good likelihood. So when you look at, what are we pulling out of the vineyard every year? There's a great article in Wine Business Monthly last year that quantified this. And there's different resources that will give slightly different numbers. So I'm using this one. For every ton of grapes we pull out of our vineyard, we're pulling out around 3 pounds of nitrogen, about 7 pounds of potassium. And so fruit is one of the few tissues in a plant that actually has more potassium than nitrogen. Usually nitrogen is the most abundant nutrient in a plant. Fruit is kind of sometimes the opposite. There's generally often more K in fruit than nitrogen. And so if we factor in, in many cases our leaves and are being blown out of the vineyard in our windy climates, the canes are being removed, and we look at how many tons of fruit we're removing, we might be pulling around 40 pounds of K per acre per year from our vineyards. And again, that could be high, that could be low. It depends on the scenarios, but it's just something to think about is, we are removing potassium at a slightly higher rate than nitrogen. And so it might be something we need to address at some point. So I think one thing that when people talk about potassium in the winemaking side and excessive potassium, oftentimes some stats that get thrown out there is that the skin has 3 times the amount of potassium in terms of like concentration than the pulp. And the seeds have a lot more potassium in them than the pulp. And so there's some thought process, the longer in red wine production you extract, you might be pulling out more potassium. And that may not be good in some situations. But when we actually look at how that adds up, the seeds have very low percentage of the total potassium in a berry. The pulp is going to have most of it. And then, so about half of it actually, and then about 40%, give or take, is in the skins. And so whether or not that potassium in the skins gets into your wine is probably to some degree, depending on if you're making white wine, red wine, all your production practices. Again, that's not my area, but at least half of that potassium's in the pulp. It's going to get in what gets crushed from that fruit, basically. So, we don't have a lot of numbers actually where we sit in the Midwest in terms of potassium levels. And so I ran some potassium samples about 20 or 15 years ago on some varieties that I was sampling. And I did it for 3 years. The machine that we were running it on was no longer available after 1 year, so I didn't get to use all 3. But if you look at ppms of potassium in juice, and this is juice, and so that's where we got to be a little bit clear is, when people throw out ideal potassium values in juice or must or wine, they're probably going to vary. And so we want to be all talking on the same terms here. So again, these are all from the same site in Ames. I don't know if these cultivar differences are statistical or if this is a trend, but just in this 1 year, La Crescent was lower in terms of K in the fruit, and Edelweiss was on the high side. And generalities are, if you let the fruit hang a little longer, there's probably a likelihood of a little bit more potassium being uptaken into that plant and therefore exported into the fruit. And so if you're concerned about high potassium levels, one consideration is don't let the fruit hang as long. Again, may not make a huge difference or not. Again, in these numbers, it didn't make a huge difference, maybe 10% difference or something like that. But if that's a concern for you, that is something to consider or think about. So, that leads me to look at, okay, what is typical, right? And so, if you do a web search, you find all these articles that suggest somewhere around 1,000 ppms is ideal, or slightly less than 1,000 ppms is ideal. and ranges between 800 and 1200 are typical. And so, we're in that typical range from this particular site. And so, we hear a fair bit about Midwest wines or Midwest grapes sometimes being high in pH, high in TA, and so forth, and may not necessarily be due to really high potassium. It could be in some cases. It may not be, though. And so, how do we know unless we measure it? And it's not something we typically measure. And one of those enology articles that I referenced in the beginning, actually, that was one of the things I recommended is looking at what your ppms of K is in your juice or must. I looked at some info from Australia, and they have quite high potassium in a number of their locations. They're talking 1,800 to 3,600 ppms in Shiraz there, so much higher than the numbers I showed. And so, if you're in a situation where maybe potassium is quite high, they may have some great information out there, but in the just limited sampling I did, we didn't see these high concentrations that they have. So how do we tell if we have enough potassium in the vineyard? There's two good guides that outline ideal levels of nutrients in our petioles. And there's some debates now going on if leaf blades or petioles are better at diagnosing a potassium deficiency. And I got a project starting that's going to be helping look at that a little bit. But regardless, the numbers between these two sources aren't that far off. And we're going to focus on the Veraison ones. So the wine grape production for the East talks about 1.2 to 2% potassium is ideal or normal in petioles. Midwest grape production guide lists those numbers as slightly higher. And so, different resources will indicate which ones are ideal. So I wouldn't get too hung up over, let's say my potassium in my petioles is 1.3. According to one resource, you're fine. According to other, you're a little low. And so I wouldn't panic if you're in those levels. So here's some petiole samples I did last year from two very different vineyards in terms of yield and so forth. And site one is extremely productive, high vigor site. And, all those petiole ranges were within one of the guides. So the wine grape production for the East talks about 1.2 to 2% as being ideal. And so site one was well within that. Site two was well within that, or even a little bit higher. And so, my takeaway from both of these sites is the vines are doing great. The site one, actually, they're pulling probably 5 tons per acre, give or take. At least that's their goal. And the petiole sampler is a little bit low than site two, but site two has a very low yield and very limited growth. And so sometimes if some other nutrient is limiting, that might, in a sense, have a concentration effect in those petiole samples. So you get two very different vineyards, both of them look to have adequate potassium. So, a lot of people are looking at soil sampling for their potassium values, and I'm going to suggest that doing so isn't necessarily bad, but I don't know that it's the most accurate. And there's a couple reasons for that. One is there's really no developed number saying X amount of potassium in the soil for a mature vineyard is correct, right? We don't have an exact number. The other issue with that is, at least in parts of the Midwest, we have a lot of magnesium in our soils. We have a lot of calcium in our soils too. Again, not a bad thing, but potassium, calcium, magnesium kind of compete for uptake to some degree. So a simplistic way of looking at it as they kind of move into the plant in the same path. And so we could have okay levels of potassium and lots of magnesium. And because there's lots of magnesium, it might inhibit uptake of potassium, even though soil tests might say it has enough. So. I've also seen soil samples that say that there's not enough potassium and the vines are doing great. The petiole samples say there's plenty of potassium. And so there's even been some research in eastern states saying that the current methods of extracting potassium in soil samples isn't very accurate for vineyards. And so we're not seeing a very strong correlation between there's X amount of K in our soil and X amount of K in our vines. And so to me, more information is always good. So if you have a soil sample, that's not a bad thing. It's certainly helpful, but petiole sample is probably the best way to tell, in my personal opinion, how our vine status is. So let's say you did take petiole or soil samples and you want to interpret those. Just a couple things to consider is or soil samples reports are given in two forms. And so you got to read the fine print in these to make sure we're talking about the same thing. And so some labs give it in ppms, so pounds per acre, or ppms. Some labs will give the report in pounds per acre. And you just have to do a little conversion to make sure we're talking about the same thing. So if you say my soil sample had 50 potassium, my first question is going to be 50 what? 50 ppms is going to be the equivalent of 100 pounds because to convert ppms to pounds per acre, we take it times 2. And so units matter. It's almost like pounds per kilos, right? If you're talking internationally, it's usually in kilos. If you're in the US, it's usually pounds. Again, we don't just have a number, we got to have the unit. And so here's 2 soil samples that I've been given, or the ones I've taken. Which one has the more K? If we just gravitate towards a number, the bottom one is a higher number. It's 434 pounds per acre. But the top one is 310 ppms. And so in actuality, if we convert them, so we could take the pounds per acre divided by 2 and we get 217 ppms. Or if we want to take the top one times 2, we'd have 620 pounds per acre. So the top sample actually has more K. And so again, units matter when we're reading a soil sample. So keep that in mind. We want to be making sure we're comparing apples to apples, so to speak. So here's an example of a soil sample I took for a separate project, and a couple things. There's some people still use this methodology, and I'm not sold on it. It's called base cation saturation ratio, where they look at these numbers here on the right-hand side, and they want this K percent to be a certain number. And if it's not that number, their theory is it's got to be at a certain percentage for the plants to be able to take up potassium. Maybe that worked for some folks, but in other crops, that theory has largely been disproved. That they don't believe that worrying about that is as important as it was maybe once thought, and you're going to spend a lot more money probably in terms of fertilization than you maybe need. And so that's something to consider. Also, I don't even really look at these ratings all that much. I look at the results, the number here, because the ratings is dependent on whatever lab you send it to, their interpretation. And so what is optimum for one lab might not be optimum for another, or for one plant might not be optimum for another. So we gravitate towards these, these bars because, it looks like it's easier to interpret, right? But who's to say that this particular lab, the optimum values are what we want to be going off of, because we don't know what it is. And so I like to focus on the numbers. So here we have 500 ppms of potassium, and that would be equivalent to 1,000 pounds of potassium per acre. That's a lot of potassium. This soil sample, if we use that methodology I mentioned before that I don't really subscribe to, you would be told that this potassium is too low on the base saturation thing. But yet the plants in this soil are thriving, are yielding extremely well, have plenty of potassium in their tissues, even though this soil sample is saying it's only in this medium category. And so again, ultimately what matters is how the plants are doing, not as much what is on that soil sample. The irony about this first soil sample I showed you is these plants are actually deficient in K. I took tissue samples, I have them. Now, there could be other factors going on here, but it just maybe drives home the point that just because the soil is high in K doesn't mean the vines are taking it up. And so just keep that in mind. Ultimately, it's what's in the plant, not what's in the soil. So a couple things to think about. Plants only really respond to the most limiting nutrient. And the analogy out there is like a barrel. So take a wine barrel, cut it in half, it's going to hold water. And each one of these staves is a factor in how plants grow. So it could be pest management, light, water, any of these nutrients. If I add extra K, nothing is going to change if something else is limiting it. And so, there's been some articles that have been put out there that, or there's some thought that, applying potassium at veraison might increase sugar in fruit, or applying potassium might increase cold hardiness. And some of the work that has talked about that, I think those articles you maybe need a different control to fully prove some of those. But if potassium is not the limiting thing, it's less likely that that the plant will respond by making any changes, because if something else is limiting, adding more potassium isn't going to help. And so in the case like we have here, potassium is the most limiting nutrient. And so that water in that barrel is only going to be held to the height of the amount of potassium, and it'll spill out. Like I can apply more nitrogen and it's not going to change anything because potassium is the limiting thing. And so if potassium is the limiting thing, you bet we should apply it. But if it's not, we better figure out what is limiting before we actually consider applying potassium. And so again, maybe a lame analogy, I don't know, but it's a fairly common plant nutrition analogy. I think it's pretty accurate, actually. So applying more doesn't change anything, or won't change much, is maybe a better way to put it, if potassium is not the most limiting nutrient. So in terms of fertilizer options out there, potassium chloride is the standard, I prefer it as potash fertilizer out there. It's your most economical. It's your most concentrated. This is going to be what your local agronomy co-op or whatever is going to stock. Now, if you're applying a very high amount of potassium, say about 600 pounds of this potassium chloride per acre, I don't recommend it, because it's maybe a little too much chloride than plants want. Now, eventually that chloride leaches out and so forth, but it's your most economical source of potassium, and it's readily available locally. Potassium sulfate is your second most economical. It's going to cost more, without a doubt, and it's a little bit hard to find in the Midwest, where you don't have a huge fruit industry. Plants like blueberries, this is the most common potassium source, because they're a little more chloride sensitive, and we can apply this at higher rates than the potassium chloride. But generally, we're not applying those high rates anyway. So to me, economics is important right now with our challenges with supply and demand in the grape world and prices. So something to consider. You can also use potassium nitrate. It's quite expensive if you're looking at it as a potassium source. And you don't want to apply a lot of it, because the nitrogen in potassium nitrate is in the nitrate form and it's immediately leachable. So if you're into fertigation or something like that, perhaps, low doses, quite often this might be a good source for you. But in terms of soil applications, it's more cost effective to apply potassium chloride and urea separately than buy potassium nitrate. So let's say you do actually check the amount of potassium in your petioles and in your fruit, and it is much higher than the winery can handle. How do we reduce that? The honest reality is, just don't fertilize for a while, right? If your vines are healthy and indicate that they have plenty of K in them, just don't apply it for a while. And so that's an option. It is proven that some rootstocks take up less potassium than others. Again, that doesn't really apply to a lot of Midwest growers, because we're not applying rootstock. We're not using rootstocks. So that doesn't really work for us. The other option is, again, as that fruit matures, there's a likelihood that it's taking up more potassium. So if high potassium is an issue in your fruit, maybe you don't let it hang quite as long. Again, I know that that changes other things, but if that's a major concern for you as a winery, that you think that there's a lot of excessive potassium in the fruit you're buying, letting them hang longer and longer is probably not going to help that situation. There are some studies that show a few things can reduce potassium in the fruit, none of which is going to reduce it by half or anything like that. But having too much shade in the canopy has been shown to increase potassium in our fruit. So just good canopy management practices are going to, help reduce potassium in our fruit. Again, not a night and day difference, maybe a 10% difference, something like that. Again, don't quote me on that. Doing very aggressive leaf removal, lateral removal, hedging, and so forth has also been shown to reduce the amount of potassium in fruit. There's other issues that arise with those practices as well. And so to me, the first starting point is A, do you actually have too much K? And if so, then we consider options. And then B, just don't apply it for a while, and see how things go. So those are kind of my suggestions. Again, not a lot of work's been done about potassium management in the Midwest vineyards, and so we're kind of taking other people's information and kind of extrapolating it. But the question is, do we have high potassium in our fruit? And I don't know that a lot of people have actually sampled potassium in their juice or must to show that it's a consistent issue for us here. It's very possible it is, but I'd be curious to know if anyone's actually measured it to tell if that is a problem or not. But now we can open up to discussion.